Okay. Good morning. My name's Ellen Forsyth. I work at the State Library of New South Wales. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that some of us are meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that each of the participants is on. Welcome to this hangout today where we meet, well, actually, Blue Jeans Video, where we hear from Nat Karmichael, who's the Deputy President of the Australian Cartoonists Association. This Comics and Local Studies talk is a result of a comment made by Hayden Fryer, another creative creator of comics, at the Reader's Advisory Seminar in March, where he talked about the localness of comics as part of his presentation. And that made me think, I wonder how many libraries are deliberately collecting comics as part of their local studies collections and connecting with local comics makers as well. I know a lot of libraries are connecting to comics creators for a range of reasons, but today I think we're particularly interested in the local studies elements. So welcome to the people who are participating today, and welcome to the other people who are watching online or later on. If you can pose your questions through chat, that would be really great. And I think it'll be really interesting to hear what Nat has to say. So I'll hand over to Nat now. Thank you so much, Nat, for agreeing to talk today.
Hello, and thank you very much, Ellen, for that introduction. I was going to start with a traditional owner acknowledgement, but you've done that for me. So what I was going to say is look up, look down. This is Blackfella land, and we'd like to acknowledge all the Indigenous owners, past and present, in being on this land that we're speaking today, whether it's in your local area or my local area. Let's acknowledge their past tradition in our country. So yes, my name's Nat Karmichael, and I'm a member of the Australian Cartoonists Association. I've been a member for some time, and I'm the present editor of their magazine, which comes out every quarter. If libraries are interested in a copy of this magazine, I'm happy for Ellen to share my email with participants or people joining in this seminar, and I'm happy to get the ACA to send a copy every quarter of our magazine called Inkspot. The Australian Cartoonists Association has had a long association with Australian cartoons and cartoonists. They've been around since 1924, so the organisation is almost 100 years old, and I'm really honoured to be Deputy President of that organisation. I really enjoy the role of being editor of the magazine. I'd like to just say that I've also been involved with comics for quite a long time, since the 1970s. In my younger years, when I was in primary school, I wanted to be a cartoonist, and I thought about that for many years until I was introduced to a guy called John Ryan, who lived in Mount Gravatt in Brisbane, and he sent me some of his monographs. John was a passionate fan of comic books, not only American ones, but also Australian ones. And he sent me this monograph that I still own, which talked to me about Australian comics. And it was the first time I'd ever encountered anyone talking about Australian comics. This is in the early 1970s, and I didn't know too much about that. And so John sent me those monographs, and it really intrigued me. And no longer did I want to become a cartoonist. I wanted to become a comic book publisher, an Australian comic book publisher. John put out a book, which I'm not sure if your libraries have copies of. It was published in 1979, and it detailed the Australian comic history from the beginnings of the 1920s up until the day this was published, which was back in 1979. Sadly, John suffered a fatal heart attack soon after the publication of the book, and I think the Australian comic world lost a great historian, because he had a lot of knowledge and insight about Australian comics. So I think because of that as well, I also became quite passionate about publishing comics, which I've done, and I'll talk about that throughout the hour. First of all, I'd like to talk about the fact that I believe that Australian comics are divided into three specific, distinct eras. And I think really that in these three eras there are distinct modes of printing. Printing has evolved quite a bit over that period of time. And I think there's also been a bit of a change in the content of what's happened in comics. Now, the first era that I want to talk about, I think comics are always related to history. And in 1942, the Americans were producing many comics. And Australia was involved with war. And a lot of our income from Australia was going overseas to America. And so the government decided to stop that. They felt that there was a need to keep income in Australia. That was important. And so they banned the importation of Australian comics. Back in those days, I suppose, there were very limited avenues of entertainment. There were the movies, there were shows, and there were comics. Comics were a very cheap form of entertainment. Most comics of the era cost between 4p and 6p. And so they were very well distributed throughout the country. There were print runs of... When the banning of Australian comics happened, there were print runs of up to 80 to sometimes 100,000 per issue. And so really what happened is when the American comics were banned, there were publishers in Australia who were previously reprinting comics that were licensed from overseas publications, and they had to focus on what they could get from local artists because no longer did they have the access to the American product that they were cheaply reprinting. So a lot of Australian comics were published in this era. And here just are some examples. This is John Dixon, who went on to draw Air Hawk. This is one by Sid Nichols, who was a very strong proponent of Australian comics and very passionate about producing Australian comics. I won't show you any more, but they're just a couple. There were a lot of cartoonists and artists that had a tradition in newspaper illustration and a lot of tradition in the magazines like Smith's Weekly, The Bulletin. This was a breeding ground after the First World War of Australian black and white artists coming to the fore and producing work that was of high world-class standard. And so some of these guys felt that they would move from the magazines and from the newspapers and work for Australian comics. And some of them were most successful. Some, I guess, less so. They were paid a page rate, and some were prolific, and others found it more difficult. The process for doing comics back in those days was the artist, was the writer, was the letterer. So everything was done usually by one particular artist. There wasn't the job sharing as was familiar with American comics. And back in those days, and I thought I'd just share that with you, this is a printing plate. Back in the days, I was talking before about printing changing over the years. Back in those days, a photograph was taken of the artwork and that was put on lead plates. Most of these were recycled and destroyed after printing. And a lot of the comics too took that format. I'll show you that one of John Dixon's. You'll see that even though the picture is in that direction, the actual comic is horizontal. It came across that way, and that reflected the printing plate of the era. That's an actual printing plate of one from the 1950s. Very rare and very hard to find, but I thought I'd share it with you because it's interesting to sort of see how comics were printed back in those days. So comics in the 1940s were the first era of Australian comics, and many cartoonists developed their craft back in those days. As I said, John Dixon, Sid Nichols, Eric Jalliffe, who did the Wichita's Tribe and some of the Indigenous cartoons from the 1970s and 80s, all learnt their craft around that time. Monty Webb was another. And so comics lasted for a while back in those days. They went from the 1942 right up until things that changed the industry. And what changed the industry, first of all, was television. Television came to our country in 1956, and all of a sudden, comics had an alternative entertainment medium which started to grab the Australian public's interest. So television took away some of the gloss. Unfortunately, in 1959, the Australian government decided to lift the ban on American comics. So all of a sudden, we had this flood of American comics arriving on our shores. And local publishers were able to get the rights for those comics, and therefore they reprinted those in great numbers. And a lot of the time they were in black and white. Most of our Australian comics in the 1940s and 50s were in black and white. The comics that did come from America were in colour, and some of the stories that were in those comics were ahead of the local publications here. So the advantage for buying those American comics was that you get them before the reprints in Australia, and so there was a growing number of Australian kids, I suppose, that would buy American comics as opposed to the Australian ones, and as a result, the Australian comics struggled for some time until they petered out in the very early 1960s. There wasn't really an Australian comic left by the 1960s. So Australian comic artists had to find other avenues to find work, and I just want to share some of those artists. Some of them that went back to the magazines and the newspapers, and some of them went into newspaper strip production. This is a strip, Bluey and Curly, which was done by Alex Gurney. Alex Gurney spent most of his time drawing the strip. He didn't really do much in the way of comics, but that's a sample of some of his work. John Dixon, as I said, I just showed you one of his comics. He went to work on Air Hawk, which became a very successful newspaper strip. He started that in 1959. So that sort of coincided with the end of the Australian comic era, and he continued drawing that strip daily up until 1986. So a lot of them had to find alternative means of working. Why are comics important? I'd just like to talk about that because this is part of the discussion that we're having today. And I think comics are important because they reflect a history of the day. And for example, that Bluey and Curly strip I showed you, and here's another one. These are two guys that were diggers in World War II who, in this strip, are actually in Japan. This was a strip that was published in 1947. This is an original comic book art. And they're talking about the Japanese nationals selling souvenirs made from the Hiroshima bomb and what was left of it to the soldiers. They're talking about the scarcity of matches and so forth that were found in Japan at that time. And so the artist himself travelled overseas. He went there. He learnt first experience about how the soldiers were enduring after the World War II, because some of our soldiers actually did go to Japan and they were stationed there. So comics and comic strips reflect an era, and they reflect what happened at the time. They also reflect speech idioms and also the mores of the society. I read some of John Dixon's Air Hawks today, and some of the language there is very sexist, where the male is the domineering person in a relationship, and Jim Hawke is clearly quite chauvinistic by today's standards. But it reflected an era of its time, and I think that's why comics are important. They reflect a belief system that we may have had at a particular time. And so, therefore, comics are important because they're a mirror to ourselves, where they share what was commonplace and it's reflected in the artwork, in the stories. And I think that carries on even today. I think it's probably very common too with movies and with music as well. I think that they reflect how people feel about certain things. I mean, certainly with music, you can sort of see how the sexual mores of a country have changed over the years. And I think you'll find that comics do very much the same if you spend some time studying them. And as a result, my belief is that comics need preserving. And so now we're going to talk about the second era of comics. And I'm talking about the second era, which is in the late 1970s up until the early 1980s and carrying through until about the mid-1980s. There was a new distribution system in about 1979. Comics were finding it difficult to sell by traditional methods in America, and so they were looking for a new way of trying to sell comics. And so what they did is they tried to bypass some of the distributors, and instead of having a chain of people selling comics, the publishers decided to let's go from one step from a publishing house to a distributor to a retail outlet. And you'll find that a lot of comic book stores started around about the 1970 mark with this new distribution system. And there were probably some in Australia around that time. I think Minotaur Books in Melbourne. There was probably an equivalent in Sydney. There was the Basement Bookstore in Brisbane, and these were comic book stores that started perhaps as bookstores, and then they gradually became specialist comic book stores. As a result of this, there were comic book fans that managed to congregate together. Back when John Ryan was doing his monographs and distributing his monographs to fans, he used to print these out and just send them to people that he learnt were interested in the comic book history. But with a comic book store, there was a physical place where comic book fans were able to get together and communicate with each other. As a result, fanzines started to spring up. These were more common in the late 60s in America, but they didn't really take place up until the mid-1970s and the late 1970s in Australia. And as a result, people were sort of able to sort of communicate between the cities. This is one called the Australian Comic Collector, which started in Melbourne, and I was able to pick up copies of that when I was into comics, and I found that in Brisbane. And so people from different parts of the state were able to communicate in a way that wasn't previously known. I think the comic book stores have sort of expanded as a result. I mean, back in the 1970s, they were, and in the 1980s, they were sort of limited to major cities like Brisbane, like Sydney, Melbourne, and I believe Adelaide had one, and possibly Perth. But they've expanded in recent days where you can find them quite openly in rural areas. So I shouldn't say rural, but in more regional areas. I'm talking about places like Cairns. I'm talking about like Bendigo, Parramatta. There are more comic book stores that are growing around the country now. So the medium itself is growing. Some of the people who went to these comic book stores decided, that perhaps, been growing up with reading comics and being stigmatized in some way, because comics were initially generally thought of as juvenile and disposable. And most of the reasons you'll find for not finding a lot of old Australian comics is because most families felt it's a comic, it's disposable, and it was tossed away. There were very few people who decided to collect them, irrespective of the fact that there was a large circulation of those. Some of these guys that attended these comic book stores or owned comic book stores felt there was a need to do something to start a local industry. And the boys from Minotaur Books, Greg Gates, Philip Bentley, went out and on a limb themselves, and they published this magazine called Ink Spots, no relation to the ink spot that the Australian Cartoonists Association published, but this was an anthology that they put together themselves, that they put into newsagents. And because it was in newsagents, there was a greater awareness of people who went to newsagents. They picked up these comics and they were able to discover them. As a result, they were able to take out subscriptions, or they were able to join up by getting their comics in numbers that they were able to get comics that weren't available easily in the news agencies. So these boys published their own comics, and this led to other people in Sydney. I'm talking about Gary Challoner, I'm talking about Dave DeVries and Glenn Lumsden, who put out comics like the Jackaroo, the Southern Squadron, and later on there were people like Jason Wallace who put out Hairbutt the Hippo. So this was the second wave of comics, and I also did the same. I published my favourite strip, which was Air Hawk, and this was also found on the newsagents' stands. So these guys felt that there was a need for a local scene for Australian comics. Comics, as I said, changed somewhat, and so I thought I should just share with you how the printing aspect changed. So I was keen on publishing comics, Australian comics, as I told you, and so back in those days, you used to have to go to a typesetter to get all your typing printed up, and you'd have to lay it out on pieces of paper. And this is an example of a piece of paper. It's very large, and I don't know if you'll see it on the whole screen. This is how comics were laid out in the 1980s, in the late 1980s. And from there, there was a photograph taken of this work. It's like a negative, and that's what that used to look like. And from there, it was placed on a piece of metal. As you can see, it's got blue toning. I'm not sure if that's where the term blueprint came from, I'm not sure. But anyway, from there, it was printed as a comic. This is a comic that I published in the early 1990s called The Wally Lewis Story. And I tried with many attempts to get onto Wally's managers to try and make it an authorised biography. Unfortunately, no one returned my call, so it ended up being an unauthorised biography. But this is an example of comics. This was written by myself, illustrated by Joanne Applegate at the time, and it's an example, I suppose, of comics being local to a particular environment. This is one that would be Wally Lewis would be a character known in Queensland and New South Wales, but not anywhere else, I'd wager, really. So comics can reflect local areas, and that's why I think they remain important. So what I did back then, I was keen on publishing Air Hawk, and I was fortunate to be in touch with John Dixon, the artist. He was a member of the Australian Black and White Artists Club at the time, and I joined that in order to meet other artists and cartoonists. The way it worked there is that John's work, that's the original, that was placed onto what was called a bromide, which is like a photographic reproduction of this page, and they were the things that the newspapers used to get in order to print those onto the newspaper. And what I did in my book was simply really compile one adventure per comic, and that was released on the stand. It was the first time, I believe, that Australian comic strip was reprinted in a comic. Well, no, that's not true. I think there was some done in the 1960s, but I think there were, and the Phantom does that very much today. I guess the Phantom reprints the newspaper strips from the newspapers, as well as the comic book adventures inside the through publications as well. So comics went through a second era, and some of the guys who were working in that time, Gary Challoner and Glenn Lumsden, as I was saying, have sort of been revered now, I suppose, as the elder statesman of the comic industry, the local comic industry today. And so let me talk about the comic industry today, because what's changed with comics now is that there's a different method again of printing. And the method today is via computers, and computers have changed everything, really. It's just made comics much more easier to print, to produce, and as a result, there are so many comics out there. I would have to say that I believe that there are more comics being published now in 2016 as a result of comics than there were back in the heyday of the 1940s. Sure, the 1940s had greater circulations. As I said, we were talking about 80,000 to 100,000. But these days, the print runs are much more modest. We're talking about 100, maybe sometimes 200 or 300 copies per issue of comics that come out now. And that rather than being sold in news agency to them, the models change once again, and comics are now being found being sold at different areas like that specialise in comics. We're talking about Supernova, we're talking about Comic-Con, we're talking about the New South Wales libraries have a great initiative at Comic Conversation, which is a collaboration of libraries in Western Sydney who get together and have a week of celebration of the medium of comics in around about July each year. And I think that's a wonderful initiative, and it's one I like to support. Other forms of comics getting distributed are in Brisbane. We had a collection of comic publishers who went to the Queen Street Mall last Saturday, and they sold their comics there as a collective. It was called Comic Street. It was just a collective of people trying to sell their comics in a very fast commercial area, the Queen Street Mall, where people are passing by with great amount of traffic. And just before Christmas, I thought it was a great idea to try and market these things, because it gave them the opportunity to share their comics. The downside of that, I suppose, these days, is there's so many different forms of entertainment that compete with comics, which is probably a little bit different than it was in the 1940s. I mean, we've got computer games. We've got well, I mean, just even talking about computer games, that we've got PlayStation, we've got Wii's. There are so many diverse forms of entertainment these days that comics probably have a difficulty in competing, but they still compete reasonably well. And there are comics creators out there who are still keen on drawing comics about the local scene, about what they find. This is one I found last Saturday in Brisbane. This was written by a girl. It's her first comic effort, and it's wonderful artwork, and it's talking about her grandfather in Eastern Europe, and so it's giving us a story there. Some comics are a little bit jovial. You would think that there's no local resonance in something that might be just a joke and a bit of fun, but when you read it, you'll find that there are sort of vocal idioms, and there are speech syntaxes that people say these days that would differentiate this comic to something that you'll probably find in 20 years' time or 20 years ago. As a result of comics becoming a bigger community inside this country, I felt that there was a need for a national comic. Everyone's selling things in pockets. People go to Supernova and you sell something in Sydney, or you go to a Supernova in Melbourne or a Comic Conversation in Sydney and you sell some comics there. But there was no overarching national comic. And so a couple of years ago, I started this magazine called Oi, Oi, Oi. I know some people are very upset with the fact that I used it as such a commercial name, I suppose, if you like, for the title. But the idea was to try and get a local comic out onto the newsstand again, to try and have a national forum for cartoonists and artists to show their wares. At the moment, the comic's on hiatus. I'm spending a bit of time with the magazine Inkspot, but I'm also working on another project too. I have put out other books besides comics in the past, and one that I'm quite proud of is this one called Nat Kelly. And this is where comics can be extremely important for libraries. This is a book that is a compilation, very much like Airhawk. It's a compilation of the newspaper strip Ned Kelly that appeared in the newspapers in the early 1970s. In the late 80s, I spoke to the artist Monty Wedd, and I asked Monty if he would like to put his book into a volume, because I felt that a book like Ned Kelly would be useful for schools, it would be useful for libraries, because it tells the true story, the full story, from Ned Kelly's birth up until his hanging. Unfortunately, when Monty and I got around to it, he was quite ill, but I'm very fortunate that his family agreed to the publishing of the book. I'm presently working on Monty's other work. He's done a work which is even larger. This was 147 pages. But Monty spent some 7.5 years working on a newspaper strip called Ben Hall, Old Ben Hall, and it's about the bushranger. There's been a movie that's just been released, I think, within the last week, talking about Ben Hall. But back in the 1970s, Monty, before the internet, went to different places where Ben Hall was. He went to the courthouses. He went to places where he knew that Ben Hall had been in order to try and research his material. And Monty was a fanatic about Australian history. And this is another way that comics can be useful. They can share our local Australian history with a local audience. So I'll just do a share plug. There you go. These are some of the other books that I've published over the years. Lately, just very recently, I've published this. This is Trundle. Trundle was a comic strip by Neil Madison. Neil was a political cartoonist for the Sunday Mail and also tried to syndicate his character called Trundle. Unfortunately, only 2 newspapers carried it, and so it didn't do too well. But I felt that it was too good a comic strip to let go, that we need to preserve our comic strip history and heritage. And so the reason for publishing this was to put most of his strips inside the one volume. Cartoonists and artists are an important part of our fabric, I believe, of our country's life. And with this book here, I asked a lot of Australian cartoonists and artists if they'd like to contribute a story with just a simple title called Australia, whatever they felt Australia meant to them, if they'd like to write a story. And I received a wonderful response from different artists, and I was able to publish this book, Australia, as a result. I'm more than happy to supply copies to libraries if they're interested. $10 off a copy of this book goes to Beyond Blue. I felt it's sometimes important to give to a community rather than just simply take. The Airhawk books, each $1 for those books that are sold goes to the Royal Flying Doctor Service. So these are some of the passions I have for comics. I think comics are evolving. I think they're changing. The fact that that they can be published by computers, they've been a great help to a lot of artists, and they've managed to do their work quite cheaply. As a result, you'll find that the other interests are becoming involved, and now we're getting the big publishers involved. And this is a book, The Great Gatsby, which was drawn beautifully by a Melbourne artist, and she did a great job, and so a commercial publisher has actually picked that up. And I think this is important to note. That's an adaptation of a book that's well known to all of us. And publishers are getting involved because I think that they realise that there are merits in publications. Bruce Mutart did this book called The Sacrifice, and Allen and Unwin have published this as well. So some books, even though they might be difficult to find because of the small print run, there are some books, such as these, that are more widely distributed because they've been accepted by the mainstream publishers. I particularly like the sacrifice, because it talks about the Australia before World War II, or around about, World War One, around that era. And Bruce has done some beautiful detailed artwork that encapsulates that era, not only in the artwork, but in the speech idioms. And he's put a little timepiece there in this volume, and I think it's just beautifully done. Comics, as a result, they're always, you're able to find local things in comics. This is a comic that I picked up that I had no idea of anything about the artist at all, where they were from, and there was nothing in the book to actually say where they were from. And then you get to a certain point in the book and you see a picture of a train or a tram inside the book, or a bus. And you look at the pattern, and all of a sudden I realised this was from Brisbane, because the pattern matches the Brisbane City Council buses. And it's little things like that that make this a local comic, and important locally. And it's a little signal for people to realise that's a local comic. Comics also can transcend mediums. This is a book that was published from some creators in Western Australia, and it's beautifully coloured and indicative of how comics are going in the movies these days. The American comics are becoming movies. Well, this is an Australian comic, well worth placing in your library, that has transcended and has gone into production in animated children's shows on I think it's on the ABC, I think it was showing. So these are great things. All of these comics are from Australian creators trying their best to work in a medium that is sort of experiencing a resurgence. As a result of the resurgence, there's now an annual award, usually held in Melbourne around about March every year, called the Ledger Award. And it's been going for a couple of years now, and it acknowledges the excellence in the local industry. And I think that's important, that creators locally do get some acceptance for their work and some acknowledgement for it, because it's very much like the music industry, I suppose, and the film industry. It's sort of a little niche market, but there's a lot of creative people working within the industry, and I think the Ledger Awards does encourage that. I think I'm running out of things to say at the moment. I don't know if I missed anyone's questions, if they've typed any, because I'm probably a little bit too far away from my screen, I'm sorry to say. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have. If anyone has got any questions, happy to take it. I can't really. I'll have to. Sorry, I'm just trying to read the chat message and I can't seem to catch it for some reason. I'm sorry. Here we are. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty in reading. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry.
I could read them for you if that helps, because I typed one of them in, and I might suggest other people unmute now to ask questions. One question from Stephen is, does the ACA have a register of local artists to get in contact with?
The ACA can provide local artists, yes. I don't know if it has a register as such. It has a website, and there are a lot of cartoonists listed on that website. And if Stephen can tell me where he's from, I can put him in touch with local artists and cartoonists from his area. So the answer is not a register as such, but yes, we have cartoonists all around the country.
So the best thing is to contact the ACA about that, because it's almost the same question I was asking. How's the best way for people to connect with their local comic creators?
Okay, I think the ACA is probably a good starting point. I think there are comic artists work in isolation, and so a lot of them are very shy people and very introverted. And I think it's probably part of the medium. They work alone and they don't sort of do it as a collaboration like maybe musicians do. So sometimes it's you don't always know when there's someone that's in the community that might be an artist and cartoonist. I think some ways of trying to sort of get over that is probably putting out a little notice about comics in the local library. Maybe the library's reaching out to the creators. But, failing that, then certainly get in touch with the ACA and they should be able to provide you with a list of local people. I'm happy to facilitate that if you'd like. So if people want to contact me afterwards, then I'm more than happy to try and find out who's local in your area.
Because that kind of seems the issue, because with a whole lot of these interesting short print runs, it would be good if the libraries could make sure they get one in their collection, particularly, preferably even a couple, so one can stay well looked after and cared for in local studies, and one can be borrowed heavily for reading. So, with the shorter print runs, it makes it harder to track. I think there'll definitely be quite a few New South Wales libraries interested in that Ben Hall compilation, with Ben Hall having been quite active in parts of New South Wales.
Yeah, very, yes. The other thing to say too is that not all artists and cartoonists are members of the Australian Cartoonists Association. A lot of them are either unaware of it or secondly choose not to join the association, which I think is a pity, but that's their choice. And so some of the artworks and some of the works can slip underneath the radar. I must say the only way that I find that I can keep up with it is by attending things like Supernova and comic conversations in Sydney or Comic Street in Brisbane. By going to events like that, you can engage one-on-one with the artists and creators and learn where they're from, what they're passionate about, and how to get their product to libraries, for example.
Yeah, does anyone else have questions? And please feel free to unmute to ask them. Actually, you might just unmute anyway. Yeah, because I think there's a whole lot of really interesting ideas you gave us to think about. I thought it was really exciting seeing the printing plates and the other examples of different printing styles.
Yeah, so it's changed so much, really, and it's changing fast, really. I mean, I think the benefit of the modern way of printing is that people can go to certain printers and say, listen, I only want 5 copies of this comic because I want to test out the waters and see how well it'll sell. And they can simply print 5 copies. Back in the day, you had to print 1,000 copies or 10,000 copies to get in the newsagents. So these days, it's much more economical for people to do smaller print runs, even though it's harder for people like yourselves in libraries to be able to purchase them.
Yeah, and there's actually a question that's come in from one of the people from me asking if comics creator wishes to promote their work in a large number of the libraries as opposed to approaching individual libraries. Is there a library network forward and newsletter that they may approach to showcase their work with the aim of distributing the comics to many libraries? Look, it's actually almost having to go through some of the library suppliers as the method, because we don't encourage our commercial posts on our email lists because really they would become only commercial forums. It may be something to think about, that possibly we do set up one that is only a commercial forum, and so people would only subscribe to that knowing that that's the range. But often, particularly with public libraries that are outsourcing their collection practices, they can only deal with suppliers that have been authorised. So, but that I expect would probably affect the percentage of profit that the creators would get. But contacting library suppliers is definitely a way to go. yeah, happy to provide information about some of those. Yeah, there isn't kind of a pretty way.
Another way of doing it, Ellen, I think, is probably reaching out to artists themselves. I mean, if there was one way of saying to artists, that this library, like let's suppose it's Redcliffe Library near where I live, and they want to have local artists and creators do a presentation. If they ask them about doing a presentation, you'll find there'll be a lot of artists and cartoonists who would be willing to come along, maybe to do a workshop and talk about their comics, or maybe to say how they came up with the idea. If you had a forum where they would appear, let's say in one afternoon, a selected afternoon on a weekend, for example, you'd find that many might be willing to come along, and they may even donate some of their comics to the library for allowing them to do so. If a local library wanted to do something of that nature, then the best thing to do is to get in touch with myself, for example, and I can promote that to the Australian Cartoonists Association, plus my other networks, and tell those artists and cartoonists that such and such a library is interested in having a comic forum. Would you be interested in coming along? If people are local, then they're more likely to come.
Yeah, and also like we have at some of the seminars that are co-organised by the State Library and Public Library working groups, we do have some commercial presentations, which is where Hayden Fryer presented earlier this year. He was really talking about comics as a very general way and how to connect libraries in. So I think it's getting, I don't know, both sides a bit more open in the conversation possibly.
Yeah, that's right. It has to work two ways, I think, really. I mean, maybe more comic artists have to approach libraries and say, listen, I'd like to have my work in your library. Is that possible?
But it is keeping it manageable, because there's about 80 something, and I have to do the something because we've had a lot of amalgamations in New South Wales, over 80 library services across the state, and that's with over 350 separate branches, and that's only one state. So if there are, I suppose, more streamlined methods for sales, that's also helpful, because I think you do need the local connections, but yeah, it's almost like a dual strategy with the local discussions, but then
yes,
some broader means as well.
Yes, there is a service that Queenie Chan has set up in Sydney, and I'll have to get the details for you. I haven't got it here with me at the moment, but she's brought up a service where comic book creators can download their comics to a website, and retail outlets, and including libraries, can access this catalogue and order from this website.
That would be a good one in the mix, yes.
So I can send details of that to you, Ellen, but I don't have that with me at the moment.
Thank you, and I'll make sure they become more widely available too. That would be good. Any more questions? No more questions? Sorry, my screen just went a little bit crazy. I just really like to thank you, Nat. This was great to hear that. I really enjoyed the way you highlighted the importance of Australian comics and of comics linked to history. I think it's wonderful that there's a Wally Lewis comic out there. And living in the state I do, not but like a cultural icon, so it is actually really important. And yeah, I like the way you're also highlighting the way comics were reflecting the history, but also the language nuances. And I love that example of reflecting the public transport of Brisbane too, that you could identify it by the seat pattern. That to me is really powerful local studies element there. Oh yes, now there's a question coming through. Has there been written about Australian comic book publishing questions? has there been a history written about Australian comic book publishing companies?
I'm dealing with an author in Brisbane right at this moment called Graham Cliff. And Graham's planning to catalogue, well, he has catalogued, he spent the last 8 years in research where he has catalogued every Australian publisher since 1942. He's actually detailed in each comic that's the publisher published, the name of the artist, the number of pages he drew. It's sort of an obsessive amount of work. But I mean, Graham's actually gone around the country doing this research in order to publish this book. We're just presently at the moment in the last stages of pre-production, and that is getting copyright clearances. We're just seeking 2 more publishers, and then we're ready to take it a little bit further. John Ryan's book was the only real one that covered the industry in any detail, but I do believe there have been some over the years, but not to the depth of John Ryan's book, and it certainly won't be in the depth of Graham Cliff's work.
That sounds great, and I have to admit, the National Library seems to be doing some really great work around collecting Australian comics. So hopefully that will help with them and with other libraries and all our collecting as well. Look, thank you so much. This was really great. Thank you to those who have also been participating. And I will turn the record off now. And yep.
Thank you for the opportunity too,
Thank you.